Good morning to friends in the United States and colleagues. Good afternoon to friends in the UAE and across the Middle East. Today's webinar is presented in conjunction with the U.S. Department of Commerce's Foreign Commercial Service Discover America Trade Talk series. We are very happy to welcome colleagues from the U.S. Department of Commerce, Pete Mehravari, U.S. Intellectual Property Attache for the Middle East and North Africa, and Thomas Bruns, Regional Senior Commercial Officer of the U.S. Embassy in Abu Dhabi. I'm Danny Seabright, President of the US-UAE Business Council, and today we will discuss an important topic for both U.S. business operating in the UAE and the broader Gulf, and for the UAE's plans to build a diversified, knowledge-based, forward-looking economy. Intellectual property protection. This webinar is very timely in that it follows the U.S. Trade Representative's removal of the UAE from its Section 301 watch list just a few weeks ago. This is in recognition of the significant efforts that the UAE has taken over the past number of years to strengthen its intellectual property protection regime and framework in many important ways. We are delighted to have over 400 registered guests for today's webinar, to include business executives, government officials, thought leaders from the US and the UAE and the wider region in the Gulf. This includes partners and friends from various US government agencies, numerous US states, which is always very important to our mission, including Alabama, Florida, Indiana, Minnesota, Missouri, Ohio, South Dakota, Pennsylvania, Utah, and Washington State. We also welcome UAE embassy officials in Washington, D.C. at the embassy's D.C. Trade and Commercial Office, as well as officials from the Dubai Department of Economic Development. We also have reporters on the line from the Wall Street Journal as well as law.com. I will note that this session is on the record, and a video recording of the event will be posted on YouTube very soon after. Attendees, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens for any questions that you might have for our panelists. I'll curate the Q&A and we'll make sure to try to get your questions answered. To start off the webinar, I'm very pleased to introduce Thomas Bruns, Regional Senior Commercial Officer at the U.S. Department of Commerce, who is based at the U.S. Embassy in Abu Dhabi. Thomas has been with the Department of Commerce since 2008 and has over 20 years of professional experience in both public and the private sector. Prior to serving in his current role, Thomas served as the Deputy Senior Commercial Officer at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. Thomas, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Danny. Much appreciate the intro, and especially your partnership and the Council's partnership on this event, among many others. The Business Council is a terrific partner and a Discover America partner, so we really appreciate it and everything you do with us for this webinar and among many other activities. Thank you for the introduction. Commerce in the Gulf has a very good footprint, where we have not only the International Trade Administration with offices in the U.A.E., Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Kuwait, but we also work with partnership posts in Oman and in Bahrain. We also are pleased to have our Bureau of Industry and Security office that has an attaché based in Dubai, as well as the U.S. Patent and Trademark Attache, Pete, who you'll be listening to in a bit. So it's a real whole of commerce effort in the Gulf with a lot of different resources that you can access. Specifically on the topic of intellectual property, it's terrific having Pete in Abu Dhabi now, where he covers from which he covers the MENA region. But I'd just like to emphasize that intellectual property is very much a priority for the entire commerce team. It is central to everything that we do. And the beauty of having Pete's expertise is he's able to educate the entire commerce team on the importance of this issue, because it is important now and important in the future, especially in the context, Danny, of what you talked about in the move of the UAE towards a knowledge economy. The specific announcement of the UAE coming off the Special 301 list, I think, is terrific news. And I want to thank you, Danny, for all your efforts and U.S. industry's efforts writ large in addressing this issue and raising it and bringing it up in different forum over the years. I think it was really helpful to work with you through that. So thank you for your partnership and that of the council and other business associations. But I also think it's only the beginning. I think right now in our discussions with Emirati officials, what we're feeling is a real momentum towards further reforms to develop the intellectual property environment in country, to be able to reach that vision and that goal that you talked about in your intro. So we're working with Emirati government officials, the Business Council, and other organizations in industry writ large to see what we could do to help move that forward and attract more companies to this market and to the broader Gulf region. A couple of things that we're looking to do over the next several months that I just wanted to highlight is one, a digital transformation trade mission that we're organizing for late October to the Gulf, with stops in Qatar, Kuwait, and Saudi, and an optional stop in Dubai. And of course, our Trade Winds trade mission. This is the marquee trade mission for the U.S. government every year that's scheduled for March 2022. Using Expo 2020 as a platform. I think that'll be a really wonderful opportunity for companies to discover the UAE and the broader region. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Danny. Thank you again for your partnership and the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you so much, Thomas. I have to say, we have been working on this issue jointly with the U.S. government and the UAE government, and in my recollection, at least for 7 or 8 years, long before you came on the scene there. But your energy on the issue has been welcome. Our Emirati partners have responded well to the U.S. government, UAE government dialogue on how to make their measures more effective and potent and important. And as a result, they are a leader, if you will. The UAE is in the broader region for what they're doing on IP, a very, very important leader, one to be emulated, one to be modeled by others for sure. I hope that'll come out a little bit in the discussion that we're about to have. And I know that this is a critical issue for helping the UAE move forward on its development and diversification goals for the future. And they have stepped up to the plate, rightly so, in many, many ways. And so the US-UAE Business Council has been very happy to have been a thought leader throughout this whole process over the last, literally almost 7 or 8 years now. So with that, I'd like to introduce Pete Mehravari, who serves as the U.S. Intellectual Property Attache for the Middle East and North Africa in the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Pete has served in his current role since 2017 on the ground in the region, working as the principal officer within U.S. embassies and consulates throughout the region on matters related to the protection and enforcement of IP rights. Prior to this role, Pete was with the United States Patent and Trademark Office for nearly 8 years, serving most recently as a patent attorney. Pete, we won't hold the lawyer background against you in any way. We all need our lawyers, so thank you for that great expertise. Pete, over to you to provide a brief introduction about your work before we then dive into the moderated discussion. Thank you so much, Pete, for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Danny. And again, it's always a pleasure to work with the council. Just the work you do really kind of accentuates the importance of IP for businesses to make that transition between the US and UAE really work out well. So as Danny mentioned, the US Intellectual Property Attache for the Middle East, North Africa. The US government has about 13 of us around the world. Our job is to be a centralized resource for US companies that want to bring their intellectual property to other places around the world. We really have three key sort of tasks. One, any US company coming to the region, we're sort of your initial spot if you want a briefing about how do you protect intellectual property in other places around the world, how to enforce your rights, what are some challenges that exist, what are some opportunities that exist. So every week I probably speak with between 10 to 20 different companies, from large entities to startups to SMEs. It's one of my favorite things to do. Coming from being an engineering background, I love talking with inventors. I love talking with entrepreneurs. And that's one of my favorite things to do. So if you have questions about intellectual property in the Middle East or Africa, please reach out to me. If you have questions about other places around the world, you can find all of the USPTO's IP attaches at uspto.gov. We have 3 attaches in China. We have many in Latin America, all across the world where US companies want to do business. So again, our first responsibility for US companies. Second, what we do is work very closely with the foreign governments in our region. So often I will work hand in hand with my foreign counterparts, helping them draft new laws, improve their IP framework, and also to train them how to, for example, examine patents, help them do raids, work with our stakeholders back in the US, for example, our DOJ enforcers, how do they enforce IP rights other places, expand that capacity overseas. So number 1, US companies. Number 2, working with foreign governments. Number 3, we do a lot of outreach. Being an intellectual property person, it's not sort of something that's familiar with everybody, but most people are creating intellectual property, be it artists, entrepreneurs, engineers, innovators, all of this stuff coming out of your minds or knowledge, that's intellectual property. I want to make sure that everyone around the world understands the value, because if they understand the value overseas, they're also going to understand the value of intellectual property coming from the US to this region. So that's a big thing what I do. But I will emphasize again, the US has about 13 of us around the world. We are IP nerds. I live, breathe, and sometimes dream intellectual property. When I'm walking down the street with my wife, I'm looking at counterfeits. I'm looking for IP theft. It's in our minds. It's what our attaches do. And I think Danny and Thomas know I love talking about intellectual property, sometimes maybe too much. But for US companies, that's what I'm here for. So I'll turn it back to Danny to get the discussion going. But again, it's one of my favorite topics, and I'm looking forward to today's discussion.
Well, Pete, thank you so much for your enthusiasm and the expertise that you bring to the job. It's really critically important. And when the U.S. first decided to put an IP attaché out in the region, I guess some 3 years ago now, if I'm right, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was a very, very important and prescient step by the United States government to do that. So thank you for the critical and important role that you're playing in this work. I want to remind viewers that if you have a question, please put it into the Q&A function. Thomas, myself, Pete will do our best to answer the questions. I'll curate them, try to get them on the screen as appropriate. With that, let's dig right in and jump right in. The UAE was recently removed from the Special 301 report watch list. Pete, give us your initial thoughts on this important development. What contributed to the removal of the UAE from the list? What notable differences has the UAE government seen in the UAE with regard to IP protection? And what is the significance of this for US business operating in the UAE or considering establishing operations in the country? Just unpack that, if you will, and sort of walk through some of those important steps, if you don't mind, please.
Thanks, Danny, of course. I mean, I think one thing to be very clear about is the Special 301 process is industry driven. Every year, US industry provides public comments that express what do they need in our key trading partners to protect their intellectual property, because those companies want to come abroad, want to expand their markets, want to grow. And it's important that those companies have a venue to express concerns when it comes to intellectual property rights. So what we saw in 2018, Danny, was that the US companies for many years, I think finally found that there were enough issues about protecting IP in UAE that they recommended the United Arab Emirates to be put on the Special 301 watch list. And I think from then it was sort of a wake-up call, not just to US companies, but I think to the Emiratis and to us as the mission out here in UAE that, you know what, US companies are having some challenges. Let's focus on this as some way that we can increase the partnership between our two two countries. So what we saw over the last 3 years was, I think, really one of the most incredible experiences I've had in the region about clear government to government, industry to government partnerships, about recognizing there were challenges, being open and honest that these challenges existed, and then finding productive industry-driven ways to solve those challenges. And I think in UAE, it's a perfect example of a country that saw there was an issue, but listened to industry. It let industry drive the conversation. It let industry drive the solutions. And I think one thing we're seeing out here in UAE is it is an industry-led economy. And we're seeing that slowly build up. And I think this process of seeing there was an issue, coming off Special 301 list with tangible solutions, I think is really a showcase to the Emiratis recognizing that to have a knowledge-based economy, it needs to be industry-driven.
So Pete, from my perspective, when we first started raising this with the Emiratis and the Business Council engaged on behalf of our industrial members, our corporate members, if you will, in a number of different ways. We wrote quiet letters to Emirati government, senior Emirati government leaders. We discussed it at various forums. We engaged with the UAE ambassador in Washington, D.C. extensively on it in the beginning with U.S. Ambassador Barbara Leaf at that time in Abu Dhabi. What was the Emirati reaction in terms of, did they get it? Did they understand immediately that this was part and parcel, an important thing that they needed to consider and think about as to help them meet their development goals going forward?
That's a good question. I think that there's definitely ways to approach change. And I think we initially had tried to sort of say, you know what, there is one concern here, there is one concern here. But one of the reasons why I like the 3-1 process is the industry isn't just one company. The industry groups that submit represent sometimes hundreds of companies. And that means thousands, sometimes millions of jobs in the US that are behind these submissions. And I think that provided a very kind of a stronger, but more, I think a more public and direct way about it. But I think once that sort of public messaging came out with the original 301 watch list listing in 2018, I think then we were able to have those sort of more quiet, productive discussions moving forward. And I think that became very productive. And again, I think it's productive, Danny, when the business groups, the industry sort of councils come together and they support the Emiratis in fixing these concerns, because I think that shows that industry is here to help and to find the solutions to these problems, which in this case, we were very successful in doing.
So the 2021 301 report says that the UAE was removed from the watch list due to the UAE Ministry of Health and Prevention resolving concerns with IP protection of pharmaceutical products. So, and I remember working very, very closely with our pharma companies on this in the beginning and through the middle, and making sure that we represented industry very well on what they were trying to put forward. What were just review for us for what were some of the concerns and how they were resolved? And what does this mean, really, in my mind, most importantly, what does it mean for future cooperation in the life sciences arena? And what lessons can we draw from this for other verticals in the industrial diversification going forward?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Danny. I mean, I think the pharma issue is, I think, one of the things that kind of sparked the realization that there needed to be some really tangible change in UAE going forward to make sure they could live up to the promise of delivering an innovative knowledge-based economy. And I remember it was, I think, early 2017, I was actually flying to UAE my first time for work, and I landed on the ground, and the US company that had an issue with the pharma had sent me an email on the plane. So I literally ran from the airport and met with this company, and that was sort of the start of trying to fix this issue. And what happened was that initially UAE was one of the safest places to bring innovative pharma, innovative bio solutions for many, many years. And it turned out that in one case, something had happened, and a US IP rights had been sort of violated, unfortunately. But no surprise, industry was shocked because this had never happened before. And so what it turned out was there had been a lot of sort of behind the scenes, really good ways to protect IP, but there was still some questions. And for intellectual property, certainty is key. And so when something sort of popped up that there was an issue, the entire industry became nervous. And an industry that has so much R&D behind it, having uncertainty in markets is just a huge challenge. And so we were able to then work with our local pharma groups, Pharma Gulf, here in UAE, with their IP committee especially, to find an industry-driven solution to that. And Danny, as you know, I mean, change takes time, and sometimes it takes a little bit of repetition. But after about 2.5 years of going through of why would having certainty in the intellectual property system be important to bringing new innovative pharma, new innovative biotech to UAE, the Emirati government in last September passed Decree 321, which honestly provides some of the best protection for innovative pharma, innovative bio in the region. And it's an incredible decree, but I think it's more of an incredible message from the Emiratis that says, you know what, certainty is critical. We know it's important. And here's our statement, our testament to having the desire to bring these companies to UAE. And I think not only it provides sort of a symbol to the Emiratis of this is a good place to do business for pharma and biotech, but I think a symbol to the region of, you know what, you can't just have okay IP protections if you want to attract business. You have lots of really good IP protections around the world already. But in order to attract and be competitive, you need something different. You need something stronger. You need something competitive. I think that's what the Emiratis did with Decree 321.
Well, and as we know, the Emiratis are very, very keen to continue their march forward in making the UAE the most business friendly, the most business proper place in the broader region for American companies and other companies to come set up for the future. And we're just going to see more and more reform in the months ahead to solidify that even more than it already is. Before we leave this particular topic and move on to a couple others, are there any other verticals in your mind and from your observation, other than pharma, life sciences, biotech, that need some special work right now with the UAE, or are things moving along well?
I mean, I think that things are moving on well very generally. But I think one vertical that I definitely want to mention is probably one of the most common pieces of intellectual property or competitive advantages that US companies have is trade secrets or business know-how. And right now, it's still sort of a new topic here in UAE, but something that is so critical for US companies, especially in highly IP-intensive industries. High tech, aerospace, defense, energy, trade secrets make up a huge portfolio of their intellectual property. And when we're doing business out here and helping our companies, we've had some kind of, not situations, but some initial concerns about, will these trade secrets be protected? What about IP ownership in these types of contracts between a US company, Emirati entity that sort of revolve again around trade secrets and IP ownership? Again, these are things that I know that companies are working very closely with the Emiratis on, something that also Thomas, myself, and Washington are also very focused on, especially as I think the environment gets even better and companies are bringing more of their high-tech IP out here. And if I can, I'll share one story about why this matters. So we had a US company come to a trade show in UAE a few years ago, and they had this sort of invention. And they came to me and they said, hey, Pete, look, this is our competitive advantage. This is the new technology that we just sort of invented. This is our new incredible thing that's going to be make our company succeed. If this gets stolen or this fails, we're going to lose the company and lose the business. But you know what? We also have version 1 and version 2 of that product. That, you know what, if it gets sort of stolen or gets out in public, it won't hurt the company. And so they came to me and said, Pete, like, should we start disclosing that best product we have? And I said, you know what? Right now, we're still working on trade secret protection out here. There's still some concerns. And so the company went forward and was offering their version 1 and version 2 of that product. But knowing that the Emiratis, they want the best, and in the region, they want the best, it's important to put in place the best IP protections to ensure that the best IP comes out here. And for trade secrets, that's a critical part of a lot of US industries.
Well, and Pete, the Emiratis have also realized and verbalized and stated that creating IP in the UAE for the future is going to be critical for their success. into continuing to diversify their economy and move it to the next level of the knowledge-based economy, if you will. They've told me many, many times, not to put it too fine a point on it, but in the next 5 to 10 years, they want to be the new Singapore with regard to creating IP on the ground. They know, and every single UAE government official that I speak with tells me they're not going to do that alone. They're going to do it in partnership with American business companies and others, with American universities and institutions that want to come and do R&D and create new IP in the region. So, I mean, thinking forward, thinking ahead for the areas where where this needs to be tightened up as much as possible is going to only benefit the Emiratis. And I think coming out of the Section 301 discussion that we've had over the last 3 years on pharma, the Emiratis really understand this and appreciate it. And I guess I would ask you is, do you get that sense from other ministries besides Ministry of Health and Prevention that they understand this? My sense is they do. I'd like to hear your perspective.
Oh, absolutely, Danny. I mean, I think it's one of the fun things about being in the region is that I think the entire region, UAE in particular, but also the Gulf and North Africa, IP is a positive word. Everybody wants to be involved in intellectual property. They know that it's critical to create jobs, have startup growth and all that stuff. And same in UAE, Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Health, and even at the Emirate level as well. Working with Ajman DED recently, Abu Dhabi DED, Dubai Police, everyone has IP on their tongue. They know it's important, not just for companies, but also to protect consumers. But one thing I would mention, Danny, I think as a next step in looking at Singapore as an example, one of the ways I like to talk about intellectual property is compare it to real property, compare it to houses or physical buildings. And I think what we're seeing right now in UAE in the region is an interest in creating intellectual property. But one thing you need to have a resource outside of that in order to use those pieces of intellectual property. So for example, if we go out and just build 1,000 houses, but we don't have any training programs for a realtor or someone to grant loans for those houses, does having those houses exist mean anything? And I think it's one thing we are seeing sort of a lack now in the region is experienced people that can take this intellectual property that's being created out here and use it in a way that actually makes the creation of that IP useful. And so I think one thing we're trying to focus on also is encouraging the Emiratis, encouraging the rest of the region to invest in creating IP experts. Make sure IP is a profession that people out here can do, because if the country is so heavily interested in creating IP, owning IP and using it, you need to have those resources, those home inspectors, those mortgage counselors that work on real property, same types of resources are needed for intellectual property also.
Oh, that's fantastic. And of course, I think the Emiratis understand this really well. They understand that they're in the process of building an ecosystem. And as we know in the US, building an ecosystem and changing behaviors takes time. But the Emiratis are doing it, trying to do it almost at light speed. I want to come to the issue of the GCC and intellectual property protection, but before I do, I want to cover one or two other topics, and that is first, the 2021 report also stated that the UAE was removed from the watch list due to progress on long-standing IP enforcement concerns, particularly with Dubai customs and counterfeit goods. I understand that the U.S. is currently very pleased with the UAE's progress with regards to counterfeit goods, whether in Abu Dhabi, Dubai, or as you mentioned, Ajman. Talk to us a little bit about the progress that was made and how it was made. And if you wouldn't mind, talk about some of the operations that have been done of some of these notorious markets within the UAE. And then I have another follow-up question or two in that regard, please.
Absolutely. I think it's just, again, sort of an inherent challenge that UAE had to take up with Dubai and Jebel Ali being one of the largest transshipment points of products in the world. Obviously, counterfeits were going to come to Dubai and to UAE. And so industry saw that this was a growing problem, and in the 2018 report highlighted that, you know what, it's been difficult to do actions in UAE. Part of the reason, again, I mean, with having 7 emirates and each emirate having a customs authority, a police authority, an economic authority, each of those had different IP enforcement procedures. And so there was a lot for industry to do to work with the Emiratis to fix the issue. And so over the last, say, 2 years, there's been some incredible developments. And I think seeing the Emirati government understand it just wasn't one counterfeit in here or somewhere in the street over here. Seeing it was actually wholesale amounts of counterfeit goods either entering UAE or being transshipped through its ports. We saw really an acknowledgement at very senior levels in the Emirati government that they were going to take a stand against counterfeits. We saw a significant increase in seizures, proactive seizures by Dubai Customs. We saw our friends down in Abu Dhabi go out and do raids when US companies were just coming at them very quickly with reports of intel. And then most notably, up in Ajman, there's the Ajman China Mall, which was one of the hubs of counterfeit goods for all the China malls in the region. And with the help of the Ministry of Economy, with the help of Ajman DED, and also, Danny, I need to mention, there is an industry group that does IP in UAE, the Emirates IP Association. These 3 organizations together really partnered with me and also the American Brands Forum, which is a group of US brand protection managers through the AmCham Dubai to make Ajman China Mall a focus. We focused on it starting in January this year. We visited the mall almost every single week. And the Ajman authorities were fantastic. They cleaned up the mall. They put out IP signs. Our companies return to that every few weeks to check it out. And it's just been a transformation. The counterfeit goods were moved and legitimate trade is now in that mall, where for a decade or for a year or for 10 years or so, it's been sort of the biggest challenge for US companies. And so just seeing the acknowledgement by the Emirati government that this is a priority, I think is really changing the views for US industry. I think, again, the 301 report being industry driven and our companies saying, look at the progress being made. I think for us, the US government, it made it an easier decision.
That's so when we first started working on, when the Business Council started first working on this issue some 10 years ago, there was an awareness of the problem, but the issue of destruction versus returning the goods to their where they were shipped from was a problem. Has that been largely resolved? Are the Emiratis working with you to focus primarily on destruction right now and not just shipping them back to where they came from?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think I wouldn't even say destruction. I'd say the Emiratis are looking more at recycling and more eco-friendly ways to dispose of these goods, and it's been fantastic. For example, again, I'll mention Dubai Customs. For the last 18 months, almost 2 years now, Dubai Customs has been leading recycling efforts publicly for these companies to see what happens to the products that they seize. So there is no more question about where those products go. We can see the products being recycled by the Dubai Customs. And even during COVID, Danny, we were doing virtual destructions with the Emiratis to actually show US companies, even though we're in lockdown, this was still a priority for them, especially when it came to COVID-related products as well. So that didn't stop. And then the efforts to show these goods are not going anywhere else, I think, continued. Again, I think it's a big testament to UAE leadership to make that a priority.
And then the last question on this in this area, the coordination among the Emirates at the Emirate level and the local authorities at each Emirate and with the federal level has really gone very well and really improved, correct?
It definitely has. I mean, I think we've had some great efforts by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, by the Ministry of Economy to coordinate between the Emirates when things happen. I still think we could use a bit more engagement between the Emirate levels themselves. For example, I mean, there aren't just counterfeits in Dubai. There are counterfeits in Dubai. Maybe they moved counterfeits to a warehouse in Sharjah, and having efforts at the Emirate level to coordinate, for example, raids at the same time in different Emirates, I think that could still be improved. But at least, Danny, I think we're definitely on the right track. I think we're moving to that that solution. And I think, again, I mentioned before the Emirates IP Association. This is a group of Emirati stakeholders, Emirati officials that come together that, I'll be very frank, love IP and are helping us coordinate those types of inter-Emirate actions.
Great. Let's turn to the broader region, and I'm going to ask Thomas to come back on here as well because of his role and his responsibility. It's not just the UAE, but it's the broader Gulf region. U.S. companies can currently get patent protection via either UAE authorities or the GCC Patent Office. What's the current situation with regard to the GCC Patent Office, and what's the future of this office? I know there's been a lot in the press lately, and I know we have a number of questions in our chat box and our Q&A function about the GCC process. So, Pete, why don't you take a stab at it, and then Thomas, fill in the blanks from your perspective, please.
Sure, Danny. Yes. So I mean, just for those not familiar with this option, so the Gulf Cooperation Council includes all 6 of the GCC countries, so Saudi Arabia, Oman, Bahrain, Kuwait, UAE, and Qatar. And for about 10 to 15 years, you could file a single patent application in the GCC Patent Office based in Riyadh and get patent protection in all 6 countries. And as some of those might know on the call, patent protection is geographic. So for example, a US patent will only get you patent rights in the US. A US patent won't get you patent rights in Saudi Arabia. So you'd either have to use this regional patent office to get rights in all 6 countries, or file in each national IP office to get patent rights. This has been going on for many years. Industry have been very happy with the speed and quality of these regional patents, but it had been a system that had been around for a while, and there needed to be some improvements. Unfortunately, what happened was on about January 5th, the GCC Secretariat announced that they were going to temporarily stop accepting new regional patent applications. The existing applications would still be processed, but the GCC countries were looking for a new solution to this. We are now at the end of May, and we still don't have a definitive answer of what is next. Thomas and I know industry, senior officials in the US, senior officials for US government out here have repeatedly raised this issue. For, again, being a patent person at heart, Danny, I know how long it takes for US companies to make patented products. And that process paired with the patent system is all about timelines. So having this sort of change overnight doesn't help companies protect their intellectual property in the region, provides inconsistency, provides uncertainty. And so for us right now, it's a huge priority, not just to figure out what's going to happen to this regional system, but also to make sure that US companies, no matter what happens, have a predictable way to get patent rights in UAE and the region. We were hopeful to hear some news this week. There still might be some more developments that might come out in the coming days, but it looks like issue is still ongoing. But in that sense, because that issue is ongoing with the regional system, Thomas and I are working very closely with the Ministry of Economy here in UAE that undersees the patent office to put in place efforts to speed up the patent process in UAE itself. And we're doing similar things in the rest of the GCC as well.
Thomas, what do you want to contribute, add to that?
Yeah, thank you, Danny, for the opportunity. I mean, not much to add on the technical piece from Pete's perspective. I will say that as you know, today we were talking about this specific issue with the Ministry of Economy. Pete and I were in Dubai and speaking to them about it, and I can tell you from my colleagues in the region, we're hearing concerns. The patent, different countries had different capacity in different markets, and the GCC Patent Office allowed companies to apply there. Now, if that becomes in doubt, I think that will create delays, especially in markets that don't necessarily have the capacity to deal with the demand. So it's very important. I think the message we're providing is companies need certainty, they need predictability, and the sooner we can get answers from you, the sooner the better it is going to be for the UAE and other markets to be able to attract, Danny, the innovation you talked about to reach their own goals. So it's really in their interest to clarify this situation as soon as possible.
The GCC, correct?
I would say any market, if the closure of the patent office happens, then how are different markets going to handle this? We need certainty and predictability across the board.
So why wouldn't each country just handle it, Thomas? Why would we, as I just want to help our viewers understand why we as the U.S. would be advocating a regional office, and why we wouldn't let each country bilaterally handle it individually.
I don't think
So,
we're advocating for a particular solution, Danny, but the fact that we don't know now what would replace what the system was in the past is the concern. If they're going to transition away, okay, but what's the next step? And I think that's where we lack some certainty, some clarity in how that's going to work in individual markets.
Okay. Pete, there's just a couple questions I want to address really quickly before we move on. One is, it's one thing to register your trademark, your patent, your copyright. It's another to enforce it. What can you say about, I think you've sort of answered this a bit about how much enforcement is moving forward, but the real question is, how much would pursuing an IP violation in the UAE cost, and does commerce help with that? And then relatedly, another viewer asked, you said that you're working on trade secret requirements to make sure that U.S. companies can be confident in transferring IP to the UAE. What's the timeline that you anticipate to complete this task? Once it's completed, do you anticipate having a business environment or agreement where U.S. companies can transfer IP into the UAE industry within a clear framework?
so I think, Danny,
Two
I'll
different
start with
questions,
the,
but related.
yeah, I'll start with the trade secret question first. So I think the first thing to point out is the UAE government is looking to announce a new patent law. And within this patent law will be new trade secret regulations that we've been told about. So I think having a stronger, more definitive framework, I think will be the first step that we've been encouraging them to do. And hopefully that will come out very shortly. But again, Danny, as you mentioned, implementation enforcement is critical. So the US government is prioritizing working with the Mehravari officials, especially judges and other folks, to talk about how does a trade secret case work, to make sure that if there is a violation, there are procedures in place to make sure that the US company is compensated for that loss. And there is type of deterrent penalties to stop others from doing that again. So it is a huge priority for us. And so we're kind of going about it both at the legislative process, but also at the capacity building process on trade secret cases. On trademarks, sorry, Danny, I think I forgot the first question. If you want to repeat it quickly, sorry.
About how much does it cost to pursue a
Enforcement cost.
violation?
That's right.
And does commerce help with that?
Yep. So commerce doesn't help with the cost of doing enforcement actions, but we can definitely help streamline the process. We can definitely sort of advise you of who to file with, what are the competent agencies. So at least that takes some of the time off of that process. Currently, one thing that U.A.E. has is they do what's called administrative enforcement actions, which mean that you can go to one of the economic departments in, say, Dubai, Ajman, all the Emirates have one, and you can file an administrative complaint. So it's not a judicial case. And this is really good if there's a warehouse of counterfeit goods that you know exists. If you provide a complaint to that economic department showing this warehouse has 10,000 counterfeits of my product, this is when they are active, please go rate it. You do pay a fee, but then those bodies will go and rate it and seize the goods and later destroy it. So that's a cheaper way to do IP enforcement actions in UAE versus going to the court system through a long process. So if you're interested in just getting products seized and destroyed, that administrative process is probably the best way forward. If you want to do a more formal case, go after the parties that are counterfeiting your goods, pirating your content, then the more traditional judicial system is probably the best step forward. Again, I will also give another sort of mention to the American Brands Forum. Again, this is an industry group of regional brand protection managers from some of the large US companies that do a lot of work in the region. They are an incredible resource. And so one thing we've been doing is advising companies that want to get active in doing IP enforcement to talk with these experts who have many, many years of doing brand protection, who to work with, how to work with them, and they'll help you kind of take those steps forward.
So, Pete, are these issues or problems any different on one level than in any other market in the world that a U.S. company is operating in? I mean that you have to companies have to protect their patent, their secrets, their intellectual property everywhere in the world. It's just the nature of the beast, right?
It is, Danny, but I mean, I think it sort of goes to what UAE wants to bring. UAE wants to bring the most innovative, the most creative products. They want to create a strong knowledge-based economy, and that means not just intellectual property, but also the best intellectual property and intellectual property at high volumes, meaning that there is sometimes a larger threat there because there's so much IP in this country. And so I think that's why it makes this an important destination for us to focus on making sure all IP is important.
Thank you. That's perfect. The 2021 report also notes that the UAE Ministry of Economy has not issued the necessary operating licenses to allow CMOs, collective management organizations, Recording Industry of America and others like that, that can, among other things, collect royalties. Now, what industries are affected by this and in what ways? What would the U.S. like the UAE to do in this regard? And there may be some important developments you were able to share, particularly with regard to Expo in this case. Could you say a little bit more about that issue?
Yeah, sure, Danny. So I mean, just the idea of music licensing, I mean, it's critical. When an artist creates music and that music is being played on the radio in a public area, if that artist isn't being compensated, then how is the artist going to kind of stay in that industry? And so part of having these collective management organizations is it makes it easy for one artist to give his music to an entity, and that entity then license that music collectively with all the other rights to all the restaurants or all the malls, all the museums, so that that one artist has an easy way to collect from the great intellectual property they created. And Danny, I mean, I mean, this has been a challenge for us in UAE for, I think, 15, 16 years now to have an effective way to license music and to compensate artists for music being played in Emirati hotels, in restaurants. It's a challenge. And so we've been working with the government for many years, providing a lot of studies, again, industry driven, that show that, look, industry is not just collecting money, they're really generating revenue that's going to kind of create this new creative economy that we want to see in UAE. Because these collective management organizations don't just give money to US artists, they give money to local artists. They help create a local artist or base. And that's what the Emiratis want. And so I think we're making progress there. The progress is a bit slower than we would have liked to see. But as you mentioned, Danny, we have Expo coming up. And this has been a big priority for us to work with the Expo team, work with the Emirati government to make sure that music is properly licensed at Expo. We've been hearing some good reports over the last few weeks that Expo will be putting in place a requirement that all music being played at Expo is properly licensed. So that was great news. We look forward to seeing how that will be implemented, which again is very important. But just the fact that this is being talked about, I think is a good win for industry, and hopefully will be a way to make more progress in UAE at large as well.
Excellent. Pete, we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to give you the chance to talk a little bit about any other concerns that are coming up in the near future. We have the economic policy dialogue in Washington later here in June. We have some other bilateral meetings that are occurring. Could you discuss plans, any other plans or issues that the U.S. government is in the process of discussing with the UAE for the future that's going to help move our dialogue and our cooperation with the Emiratis further even more?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think for me, again, being an IP nerd and just thinking about IP all the time, one of the things I'm always impressed with is that how much the U.S. government at many different levels wants to talk about intellectual property, because they know it impacts a lot of their own goals. And so, yeah, at the upcoming economic policy dialogue, IP is a big part of that. We're doing other dialogues with them at high levels where, again, IP is a big focus. And again, I have to give a big shout out to Thomas, to our Charge d'Affaires, our Consul General out here for talking about intellectual property in a lot of their meetings, even when I'm not there. I think it's just a testament to knowing just the importance of intellectual property to US companies, especially SMEs. I mean, in many cases, that intellectual property is what is making them competitive. And if they're competitive, they can grow and they can create US jobs. And if something gets lost, it has such a big impact. And so for us, that's been one of our biggest focuses out here. And just to kind of talk to the audience right now, look, our job is to help everyone out there know what to watch out for. Often, unfortunately, a lot of times companies are coming to me when something bad has already happened, but we are really here for you. Our emails, again, on uspto.gov, we want to make sure that you're protected before you come to market. Our incredible commerce team is more and more reaching out to us as part of that initial work with you. And so again, we are here as a resource and a free resource. So please reach out before bad things happen, because that makes our job easier.
Great. And maybe throw this last question or two to you and Thomas both as we wrap up. I just want to make sure that we've given all the SMEs all the guidance and advice that they need. That, you know, they're the ones in some ways that need the most hands-on assistance and help when they're trying to enter a new market. Maybe Thomas has a word to say about what the Commerce Department is doing overall on the ground in the region in the UAE, or Pete, maybe you as well. I don't see Thomas on the screen at the moment. Maybe you want to take a few more words at that.
Sure. I mean, I'll very quickly. I mean, I think one of the things, again, as a former patent attorney working with startups and now working with a lot of SMEs out here, is a lot of times the companies I talk to don't think they have intellectual property. And so they come out here and something bad happens and they're upset. And so one of the things I want to talk to, again, the SMEs on the call is, what makes you competitive? What are your competitive advantages? Think about if your competitive advantage disappeared overnight, could your business still continue? If you do have something like that, it could be a form of intellectual property. Come talk to us, figure out ways to protect it. We'll advise you how to get that right, either consultations in the US, attorneys out here in the region that can provide that protection. But I want the companies to know that there's a reason that you're doing business out in UAE. It's because you're competitive. You have something to offer. Maybe it's the quality of your products, the quality of your employees, that know-how that you've had for 20, 30 years. That's important. That needs to be protected. Let's work together to make sure that you are safe doing business abroad. And we want to make sure that you're safe, especially here in UAE.
Excellent. Thomas, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, Danny, thank you so much for the opportunity. Yes, the support for SMEs is a huge priority for the Department of Commerce. And I just want to reemphasize Pete's point. Please reach out to us. We have 100 U.S. Export Assistance Centers throughout the United States. We have great partners like you, the AmChams. Talk to us. We're all connected. Commerce works together, whether it be USPTO, Bureau of Industry and Security, International Trade Administration, to help provide small and medium-sized companies the advice and the support they need in markets. But we can't do it if you don't reach out to us. So if we can talk to you in advance, we can provide some great market research. We can give you details on how markets may differ in terms of their intellectual property environment, thanks to Pete's advice. And Pete is continually, by the way, training us, where he does these coffee chats and brings our team in to make sure we're up to date on everything. And so I think that's my message is please reach out to us. You have a U.S. Export Assistance Center in your, you talked about all the states that you have on the line, Danny, and thank you for that. You have an Export Assistance Center there. They're your first point of contact globally, and then they'll reach out to us for specific market information, and then we can point them to resources like you, Danny, and others, so they're better informed before they come in. Where we have, I saw a few questions on violations earlier. Usually where we have these IP violations, it's people have come in, they've partnered with folks without necessarily, checking them, probably because they don't have the resources or the background, and then we're playing catch up. So that's the biggest thing, is trying to avoid that situation and getting out ahead of it.
It underscores the point, Thomas, doesn't it, that wherever you're going to do business in the world, and whatever market, you have to do your due diligence. And one piece of advice I give every company that calls us and asks us for help is to make sure that you get some good legal advice on the ground with people with to Pete the lawyer with lawyerly advice that knows what's going on in that market and can advise you. And we have the Business Council has at least 10 US-UAE law firms as our member companies that are on the ground in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and elsewhere in the UAE. And they're always happy to assist new companies coming to market as well with that kind of assistance, advice, and due diligence. The Commercial Service is planning an IP Attache conference at Expo 2020 Dubai, which will have an important industry component that the Business Council is supporting. Can either one of you or both explain what this conference will entail for those watching at home?
Sure, Danny. So, I mean, for example, the a lot of countries now have IP attaches. So the US again has 13. Other countries have many across the world. So because of Expo being global, we want to invite all those attaches to come to Expo to have a workshop. Again, initially just for us. It's been being an attache for IP is sort of this job that only a few people in the world have. So let's get together, figure out ways to support each other in that. But when you have all those IP experts from around the world together, there needs to be an industry component. So what we're looking for right now is, I think it's February 6th of that week. We'll be putting together an agenda in the coming months, but we will definitely look forward to a strong industry component with all of these IP, again, nerds in one area. And so as we move forward, it's going to be a fun, nerdy IP time, but really have some good impact for US industry also.
That's great. Always great when the nerds get together and solve all the problems of the world. So thank you very much for that, for sure. I used to consider myself one of those. I think I'm too old now to be a nerd. Thomas, we can't end this without me giving you a minute to say a few words about the greatest show on earth that's going to kick off on October 1 for 6 months in Dubai in the UAE, and tell us what you're doing to help American business connect with literally half the world that's going to be coming to the UAE for the Expo 2020.
Thank you, Danny, for the opportunity to talk about this. This is a terrific opportunity for U.S. companies. The UAE is already a trade show hub. We have many different trade shows that come here to the UAE every year in the energy sector. I mentioned earlier in the ICT sector, in the defense sector, in the aerospace sector, in the healthcare sector. We have Arab Health coming up. And in addition to that, next year, starting in October, we have the World's Fair, Expo 2020, that's going to begin. It'll take 6 months, and business is going to be a big part of it. There are several theme weeks throughout the Expo, and we have an amazing pavilion that's being developed, and the whole focus is going to be American innovation. And this is a great platform and opportunity for companies who are already coming to the UAE, who are thinking about the market or even the broader Gulf region, to wrap themselves around the American flag and perhaps do an event at the Expo where we have some specific VIP space and conference space at the pavilion with clients, or perhaps with partners or company colleagues, and take advantage of the American story in the context of Expo. The Emiratis have invested a lot of money, a lot of resources, and it's an absolutely amazing production, and I think will be a great opportunity for any firm that's thinking about the Gulf to use this, to use Expo as a platform. So in terms of how the commercial service can help, we obviously have, our support, trade counseling, as well as matchmaking and other services that we offer U.S. companies, and we're open to doing that in the context of Expo around the pavilion. And we're more than happy to organize that. That's under the mantle of the Discover America campaign, for which you are a partner. Thank you, Danny. And we're more than willing to talk to specific companies about that. I'll mention just one final thing that I talked about at the top, the big trade wins, trade mission, which is usually something that involves 50, 75, 100 companies that will come March 6th through the 8th. That's also an opportunity, and we're organizing that during the Expo to use it as a platform so that companies also benefit from everything that's going on at Expo. during that period. So let me stop there, Danny, but thank you for the question.
You're welcome, Thomas. And Pete and Thomas, that brings us to the end. I like to keep these things tight. People are experiencing great Zoom fatigue, as you know, but we had a fantastic response today of attendees, and we'll have that many more watch it in the coming days, watch the webinar in the coming days. So thank you both for all your energy, for all your exuberance, for all your commitment to working closely with the UAE to help, again, position them for American business as a premier market in the world for the future. Today already, but even more so in the future to come. With that, ladies and gentlemen, have a wonderful evening in the UAE and the Middle East. Have a wonderful day in the United States. Thank you again and take care.